Hello, I'm Adria Merritt, an instructional coach in Williamsburg, Virginia.
And I'm Patty Lambusta, and I'm the school librarian at James Blair Middle School, also from Williamsburg, James City County.
We're excited today to share with you a process that really does open students' mind. It creates an avenue for them to have voice and choice, and most importantly, create some impressive artifacts that show their ability to synthesize and evaluate sources from multiple places. So let's dive deeper into elevating student voice through guided inquiry.
So what 2 or 3 words come to mind when you think of students being assigned research? We're going to take a moment and have you pause and write down 2 or 3 of those words that it either can be from your own experiences being a student doing research or experiences with your own students.
All right, so welcome back. At this time, we're going to assume that you have 2 to 3 words that you have written down to help frame your thoughts about research. We're going to ask you to revisit those words at the end of this presentation to see how your thinking may have evolved, or perhaps we're going to just confirm some ideas that you've already had.
So the first question we have is, why is inquiry different than research? I'm actually going to read you these quotes because I think they're so important for understanding why we went in this direction with this unit. So first, research is embedded in inquiry learning. Through inquiry, students discover real questions about academic topics. These questions blossom into research. The extensive research that comes out of inquiry allows students to create products worth sharing. And then inquiry takes time, reflection, and persistence. It cannot be done or it cannot be rushed to get to the next unit. Both of these are extremely important, and understanding why inquiry is so different from research.
So you're going to notice as we talk about this process and give you the opportunity to think about how this can unfold in your class, it really goes back to these quotes. They're anchoring, they are the framework from which we're building how this unit is designed.
One other point, both of these quotes come from Dr. Maniotis and Dr. Kolthau, who are experts in this field.
So let's talk about what makes guided inquiry design a little bit different from other forms of research, Patty. You have had the opportunity as a librarian to guide students through research for quite a bit, and this is not your first round of helping to co-create a guided inquiry unit. So what makes it stand out as a unique instructional design to you?
Well, number one, it is grounded in constructivism. That means that students create their own learning. They build their own learning rather than having it passively passed off to them or spoken to them. They're actually building and owning their own learning. Secondly, and I think this is extremely important, it is a collaborative unit in that there is a learning team. And I've been on learning teams as few as 3 members or as many as 5. And those learning teams can be made up of content teachers, reading specialists, librarians. I've even been on a learning team that had a principal involved. This kind of inquiry spends a lot of time on connecting students to prior knowledge and helping them build that background knowledge we know they all need. It positions students as researchers. We talk to them as they are researchers through the development of critical questions and focused investigation. It gives experiences that provide structure and scaffolds, which equip students to construct their own knowledge. And finally, and most importantly, we can't stress this enough, it allows for students to have voice and choice in what they are researching.
Excellent. So as we move forward, we want to have you experience or think about co-creating, if you would, a guided inquiry project in your own mind. So what we need you to understand is the basis is this is a linear process. There are steps to a process so that students can build information off of each other. It's meant to be done over time. You want to think about a block of time where you can dedicate at least 3 weeks to a unit of study when you want to design this type of unit. And also the phases overlap. One phase builds into the next phase, which is why it's so important to go in the process that we are going to present to you.
The unit that we built actually took place over 6 weeks. So again, it can be as little as 3 weeks, but you can go almost a whole marking period with a unit like this.
So let's talk about launching. We hope that you have a scratch sheet of paper in front of you, or maybe you can use your device. So we want you to be involved as we unfold this. So consider your own curriculum at your school. Consider the themes, the big ideas, or the guiding questions that you may have within your school's curriculum. Now think about a topic or a concept your students could explore and investigate to construct new knowledge. Patty and I chose activism. The big overarching theme for the unit is finding your voice. And so within it, we looked at activism as a topic or that students could delve into and still grapple with this notion of finding your own voice.
We also asked them to think of activism as small acts, not like saving the world from hunger, but think about how they could do something at a smaller level that they would have success at.
So one of the important pieces when you're thinking about your topic, as Patty just mentioned, you want something your students can connect to, right? This is an authentic experience. So building on those connections, those real world experiences are really important to leveraging the new knowledge that's going to unfold as they expand throughout this unit. So let's talk about how you're then going to begin. The first part of this process is the open. What's so critical about this process is you really want to pique your students' interest and begin engaging their minds with whatever you decide is your topic or your concept. This is the invitation to inquiry. It's where you are stimulating their curiosity so that there is a desire to go deeper on behalf of your students.
So this is the hook. This is how you're going to hook them to be interested.
So let's look at how we did it. We're going to share with you some principles and we're going to connect it to the overarching theme that we had. And what's critical that we want you to understand about this part is this really is heavy use of pre-writing strategies where students are going to get to organize their idea. This is also the part because they're really engaging with that curiosity where they're going to make inferences and draw conclusions based on information that we have. So we started off using Mentimeter as a tool for students to share their background knowledge. We asked them to share words that came to their mind when they thought about activism. And then we use this to co-create, and that is so critical. This really is an immersive product where students are really creating that learning. It's collaborative. It is filled with revision. It is a natural unfolding of ideas. So the co-creation is important. They co-created a definition of a concept or topic that would be explored. Then, to open up curiosity more, we read text, or you could view videos, analyze primary sources to build prior knowledge and make connections to the topic. And it's important to have that opportunity for discussion and to analyze additional resources. So in front of you, you see a snapshot of the Mentimeter where our students were sharing their original ideas. And you can see that for period 1 and period 2, the definitions that were co-created are different because it's important that each class, each group of students has the opportunity to share their thinking. We then chose a text as our opening to stimulate curiosity. Here we have a snip of the text that we use. And if you'll notice the hyperlinks, because it was important for us to give them connection to additional resources to increase their thinking, because again, it's about opening their mind to the idea. So here our students were able to use a graphic organizer where they were able to open up hyperlinks that connected them to videos or images or other text that was related to that specific quote. And so in terms of making connections, the students had to, and analyzing details, record exactly what they saw in that clip, and then go further to connect it to what does this have to do with the larger piece? And then in our discourse, what does this have to do with our topic? We're opening the mind. And a hallmark of guided inquiry, you have to have a base of knowledge so that students can then begin to ask good questions. So look back at what you wrote on your paper. Think about the way that we structured it, allowing students to co-create and build that definition. How will you within your class give your students the opportunity to stimulate curiosity through background knowledge that you're building about the topic?
How are you going to hook them?
So our next phase, because it's linear, where are we going? Where do we go next, Patty?
We're going into the immerse phase, which is basically we're drowning them in resources so that we can build background knowledge, we can connect to the content, and we can discover interesting ideas.
And what's really cool about this part is we're building background knowledge. You're continuing to connect the content, and our students get the opportunity to summarize ideas and identify details. Because again, I love the way Patty used the word drowning. You're drowning them in this information, but we want to give them the opportunity to make meaning of this information and make connections as well. So here's how we structured ours.
So in this piece, we actually used short text and one video, I believe. Again, different than what we did with Open, where we used a poem, we use nonfiction now. And we are exploring these sources for background information and new knowledge. But we definitely modeled what we expected from the students, because we did give them a graphic organizer and we wanted them to know exactly the level of specificity that we wanted them to get to.
So as Patty said, we modeled, and then here's where the voice comes in and the choice comes in. There were 3 additional stations for students to choose from to be immersed into more idea about activism in these small acts. So they could choose one that was based upon their interests. Then as groups, leveraging what they learned from the model, right? The co-creation where they were able to work with the teachers, they were then able to go in and analyze. And here you'll see our graphic organizer. They have to talk about why they chose the topic. What are personal connections that they made? The small acts that cause whatever change and the impact on the community, because it's going back to digging deeper. Yes, you're seeing something, but now reflect on that impact as well. So we immerse them so they're gaining more information and it's building momentum as it moves forward.
And it's getting them to start to think about things that matter to them, whether it's pollution or animal rights. You're getting them to start to think about things that are part of activism.
So think about how you're designing this within your class. You have your topic, you've opened up where you've hooked them, right? You've gathered their interest and you're co-creating a frame that you're going to leverage throughout the unit in terms of a shared understanding. So then how are you going to drown them in more informational resources, right? So they're discovering interesting ideas that as the unit moves forward, they'll be able to leverage as they develop their questionings. So we're moving forward. And Patty, what's our next phase?
So our next phase is explore. Now, what works well for explore, because this is this should be a collaborative piece, that we want them to talk back and forth on what they're discovering, because again, we're trying to get them to connect to interesting ideas. So for this stage, we set up 6 stations. And we have them listed here. You can see they're all pretty well-known activist type topics. And the students then work through all 6 stations, taking notes and also talking to each other about the 3 types of text that we had. We had one text that had facts, we had a nonfiction text, and then we had a video. And so they were working in groups, talking about what they were seeing, hearing, learning about for each topic.
And when we think about our students as researchers and as readers, this really gave them practice in generating notes, right? So this was the graphic organizer. So it gave them the opportunity to take notes that show that they were understanding the concepts and gaining new information that was expanding their knowledge about the central topic. It also was connected to the source. We started building the idea that it's important for you to take note where you get your information from, right? We're researchers, and just in general, in terms of being literate, paying attention to your sources. And then there was a reflection piece where they had to start to synthesize that information. Yes, you've been given these facts, right? But what does this mean? How do you pull it all together? And you're reading across resources, but then you're assimilating this information so that new ideas emerge that you can explore later on.
And this gives them practice in what we expect in the gather phase. Like, they have to collect information, they have to paraphrase and synthesize that information, and they have to cite their sources. So we kind of had a double whammy here in that we had them exploring lots of information, but also practicing for when they actually did their own research.
So again, go back to your classroom practices, right? Think about that central topic that you think would really allow your students to dig deeper and learn more about a topic, giving them voice and choice. How are you going to open it up? By gaining their interest. How are you then going to make sure that they have the opportunity to be immersed in information to build that background knowledge? How are you going to make sure as you move forward through that process that you're giving them more information that they're going to leverage and get deeper in their expertise by having the opportunity to then explore a variety of topics so they can start reading across information, right? And then our next phase is where it really starts to intensify our students when we're seeing them through the lens of researchers. Patty, talk a little bit about this identify phase.
So you're really getting to the meat of the inquiry process. This is where they are going to start thinking about what interests them. They're going to take a moment to really pause and ponder all the things that they've been exposed to. And eventually they're going to identify their inquiry question. They'll identify their topic that they're interested in, and then they'll identify the inquiry question. And this is hard for our students. They don't get enough time and practice at creating questions. So it was very important to us that we made sure they knew the difference between an open and a closed question. So we used the QFT model, the question formula technique model, and this allowed students to generate questions, then go back and look at those questions to determine if they're open or closed, and then revise some of those closed questions because those are not good for research, and then prioritize what questions are better than others. Obviously, not all questions are created equal. So once they get to this open and closed question area, we need to talk to them about, well, what questions were better for open questions? And those are usually the questions that start with how and why and what maybe. We also talk about using good verbs like impact or affect in creating that question. They could collaborate in that QFT model on creating open questions. So they got practice together. And then of course, the whole purpose of the organizer that you're looking at is to get them to the point of writing a guided question to start with.
So wait a minute. So we have this graphic organizer here, right? And this graphic organizer is where the students were pitching their own idea. But you talked about a step before this graphic organizer that is extremely critical that I want to put a pause in, where you talk about that modeling and that scaffolding that's so important with the questioning piece. So you mean before I can allow my students, they've immersed in this information, I'm drowning them, I'm dousing them, I'm exposing them to this new knowledge with the hope that they will then, or the expectation, develop their own open-ended questions. So here you're telling me to pause the process and actually explicitly teach questioning.
Correct. So again, they need to understand that open and closed question. They need to define the topic that they're interested in. They need to know more about that topic. What do they want to know more about? They also, you kind of have to throw in there that there's this, I call it the Goldilocks method, in that the question cannot be too big, it cannot be too small, it has to be just right, it has to be that sweet spot. But most importantly, this is where we conference with the students constantly using this form, and this is where they need to determine if their question is good or not. You can conference with them and make them suggestions, but there are times when students are going to say, this is where I want to go. And once they start researching, they need to know it's okay. You can step back and revise that question if it's too big or it's not really what you wanted to learn about. It's not the topic. It's not relevant. There's all kinds of reasons. Many times students will say, I can't find information to answer this question. And that's okay to say, you know what? You can go back and revise it. It's okay. This is where students get frustrated, because that guided question is so important to generate. It actually guides them through their whole process, guides them through where they're gathering information. And it generates other questions, and they need to understand that it is okay to get frustrated with a question. You can eliminate it and you can revise it. And you can see, this is one of our students who was looking into Title IX, and I did jot some notes for her to think about, and she did come back with another question.
Excellent. So please be aware that as you're designing your own unit, that this is where you're really going to slow down. This is where modeling and explicit instruction in open versus closed questions, which we have provided for you, and the resources that accompany this, a wonderful lesson that shows you how it unfolds in the classroom, including resources to guide you through that process. But then students apply it to their own information, and conferencing is critical. That discourse where they're going back and forth with you in order to really make sure that they have a rich question and they thought about their information, and revision. The idea that this really is a process of going back and revising and changing as needed. The identify phase is critical. So think about that for you as you design this. How are you going to give your students opportunity to pause and ponder what they've learned? A graphic organizer. Identify a question, a rich question, by teaching questioning, understanding that that's going to decide their direction. Once you've moved through this phase, which is a lengthier part of the process, then we're ready to start gathering more information. And the gathering phase really equips students as researchers, right? This equips them to go through, to start looking at sources, questioning sources, and it provides a structure for students' ideas to evolve based on thorough reading of information and detailed note-taking. So let's talk about how we help our students explore, and how you can help your students explore whether or not sources are viable or not.
So this phase, as Adria said, is another, you need to plan for a big piece, a big chunk of time for this section, because you're going to have to do some mini lessons for students to really understand what is a good source, what is a credible source, what happens when I find a source that really isn't relevant to what I'm doing, what happens if the credibility of a source is questionable, what do I do? So we did a couple of mini lessons in this phase. The first was using the CRAP test. Now, there's a lot of research out there right now that using a checklist with students is not a good thing to do, mainly because websites have become very savvy, and they don't look like they did 10 years ago. However, with middle school, I find you have to start somewhere. And the CRAP test helps them recognize, is the information current? Is it relevant to what they're actually researching? Are the people who produce this website, are they authorities on that topic? Is the information accurate? I always tell students, if you have any questions about the information, one, you can check another source, or two, if it's fishy, don't use it. And finally, purpose. What's the purpose of this site? What are they trying to sell you, inform you on? And are they entertaining you? In which case, maybe that's not what you want for research. And then from that point, you take it further. You go to lateral reading, where you're focusing on the author, on the reliability, and on the actual target. And the way that you do that is you fact check. And lateral reading means you read across. And so we encourage kids to open up tabs and check the sites. You can use factchecker.org. I like to use Wikipedia because Wikipedia is pretty effective for finding out who and what is running that website. For example, I know some students found that, especially with activism topics, that there were lobbyists involved. So obviously, lobbyists have a specific point of view, and we talked about that, that they do have a bias, and that doesn't mean that bias is bad, but you need to know where they're coming from.
And so what's great here is it's just like in our other phase, right? Where we were able to model and teach explicitly questioning, and then students applied it to their own research. It's the same here. So after they go through the lesson where they learn how to evaluate sources applying the CRAP test, and then they learn how to take it deeper through the lateral reading where you're checking to see, cross-read to see, is this created with the intent it was supposed to be created, or was a lobbyist creating it, right? Reading across or learning really how to analyze like this, they apply it to their own research and to the sources that they have. This allows them to see, I might not want to use this source, or this source that I have right here is perfect. In addition, this gave us experience to teach our students, once they found the sources, how to glean information, how to pull that relevant evidence that you need from your sources, your citations, your keywords, and your note-taking. We were fortunate to have a digital platform called Noodle Tools, and in Noodle Tools, please check it out. Maybe your school library has one or is interested in investing in this. But with Noodle Tools, what it allows them to do is it allows them to generate their citations, but then take notes. And right there under it, it allows them to paraphrase. It allows them to color code and organize their note cards. It allows them to generate questions right there. So all the information that they need as they're doing their research, their thinking is visible and it's attached to the source that they use to get their information.
Noodle Tools also allows students to log what sites they've been to, and they can easily go back to the sites. And if they're not relevant or they don't need them, they can eliminate them from their source works cited.
So when we think about the resources that we'll be providing to accompany this, just like there'll be the mini lesson that looks at questioning, there'll be a mini lesson on lateral reading, because it really is important with this digital age that students are equipped with as many tools, with as many ways as possible to determine whether or not the information they're being exposed to is credible. So think about your lesson that you're designing. What structures will you provide for students to continue to evolve the reading of information and detailed note-taking? And how will you equip your students to know that the information they're being exposed to is worth taking notes from because it is credible information? So here's the phase we love, Patty.
This is the favorite. This is where all this hard work comes together, and the students begin to see their hard work is really panning out.
So you want to think of, how are you going to give your students the opportunity to construct their ideas, right? They've collected this information. How are they going to construct it? And what we love here is we were able to go beyond the writing. Writing was a piece of this, but writing was a piece. And this really became a multimodal presentation in this. So one of the ways that we did this was through the development of a project proposal that our students had to develop. And what we liked is here where you see the problem analysis and the solution analysis, the students were able to really show us the information that they learned. They showed us what new knowledge they were able to glean from exploring sources using their guiding question, that open-ended question, as the guide to chart the path through which they would look for and gather information. It set their purpose for reading. So then they showed us how they were able to write, synthesize that information, and through their problem analysis, they were able to give us a clear topic sentence that stated that problem, pull evidence that they found as they did their research to explain how it was a problem, and provide that rich elaboration that showed us how they were able to assimilate those new ideas into their thinking in order to truly understand the depth of the problem that they were analyzing. And then we're about solving these problems, right? So the solution-oriented piece, where students were able to research to see, well, what are some possible ways that we can solve this problem? Again, with that same writing structure, your topic sentence, your evidence, where you were able to show us that you were able to assimilate these ideas, synthesize these ideas, that you evaluated first as you came across them in multiple sources, in order to propose what is a way to solve this problem. And then the artifact. Talk about that more, Patty.
So with the artifact, they had to describe their artifact to us and how it was going to inform whatever audience they had chose. And you can see we asked them to determine what their target audience or who their target audience is. And then the artifact rationale, like why do you believe your artifact is synthesizing everything you've learned and is a great way to propose your solution. Now, I want to point out, you're looking at it, our exemplar, the students struggled with this. Some of them have never been pushed this hard to write a proposal, a project proposal. But this was another opportunity for us to sit down and conference with them and push them a little bit harder. Some of our students submitted their original project proposals and they were about 50% or 70% of what we expected. We wanted more from them. So we conferenced with them and pushed them harder. And they were able to rise to that challenge.
So Patty, what I'm hearing is a critical component, and we've talked about this throughout, the conferencing. That conferencing piece, the reflection piece, allowing students to reflect on that feedback, and then revision, showing students that throughout this process, revision is what writers and thinkers and researchers are constantly doing. So this really does infuse this within that process.
It does. And that revision, sometimes I've heard teachers say when they have to revise papers, students get frustrated. They don't want to go back and redo, but they can and they must. And through this process, they begin, because they're reflecting on their own learning, they begin to recognize it's okay to go back and revise.
And it's revising for a purpose. Can we say that? It's revising for a purpose because it guides the next step of where you're going. Excellent. So think about within your own class, right? Your students have been through this process where they have gathered this information, they've researched. How are you going to allow them to then sit back and reflect on what they've learned, show you they have assimilated these ideas into their own thinking in order to create something new? And then they get to share the fruits of their labor. So let's talk about how we structured sharing.
So in the sharing process, we actually had the students well, first of all, they had their artifact, and then they had to do a video through Flipgrid explaining their project and explaining their problem and solution and how their artifact tied it all together. We then created posters throughout the library, and on the poster was their guiding question. Their artifact was nearby. And we also pulled the 2 paragraphs, the problem analysis and the solution analysis, with their video and presented it in a gallery walk. And the gallery walk were all students from both classes have their section of the library set up, but it wasn't just the students from the 2 classes that have done a walkthrough. We've had students from 7th grade who will be 8th graders next year and will be doing this project. We thought it was a good idea to let them see what the year before had done and talk to them about it. And it was very encouraging to see them, how excited they were knowing that they were going to do this next year. We've also had staff come through, and just any class that wanted to see were welcome into the library to look at what these presentations were all about.
And a critical part of this was also the rubric, right? Having very clear expectations from the onset so students knew what was expected. And if you notice, a part of how we evaluate our students was the process. Throughout each part of this process, there is a formative assessment. There is a check for understanding. There is a graphic organizer that allows their thinking to be visible through each phase, because remember, each phase builds upon the other. Also, the quality of their product, right? Is your product containing the content of your research, and is it quality? And that AEC response where you're able to clearly articulate your ideas in writing and publish them using a multimedia form to clarify your information. So here you'll see an artifact that a student created, and this is the digital artifact, the visual component. He designed a documentary, and it was accompanied with a presentation of him explaining it, as well as that AEC format. And the other piece of the sharing that was so critical was the feedback component. In the gallery walk that Patty spoke of, students walked around armed with sticky notes. There were sticky notes where you could see the student's guiding question. So you weren't looking at the artifact as a standalone, but you were looking at it in terms of its ability to answer the guiding question. Did it represent? And then students were expected to provide very clear, very specific feedback to their peers' presentations.
One more thing, going back to that student's artifact, the nice thing about, or the great thing about the Create, it allows the student to create a product, an artifact that represents them. So that child, he was really into the graphics of creating that poster for the documentary. Where other students, if they were good at poetry, they wrote a poem. My personal favorite was a short story written by a child who was, his whole project was about pollution and the effects on the fishing industry. And he told a short story from the perspective of a fisherman and a fish. Very creative, again, giving the student voice and choice.
So when you think about this in action in your class, how will you provide the opportunity for students to creatively present what they have learned? Understanding that the purpose of gathering new knowledge is to be a citizen who is able to clearly communicate. So are we providing that space for them to be able to clearly communicate their ideas? And then our final phase of our process is evaluate. So how will your students have the opportunity to evaluate how well they did throughout the process, what problems they may have encountered in their research process? So Patty, let's talk a little bit about how we engaged our students in this evaluation process.
With the student, I think this is one of my favorite examples of evaluate. These kids did really, really well in thinking about how they learn, thinking about the process itself. You can see where they had a concentric circle where they're discussing the comments that they found on their projects. But over on the side, what I thought was really exciting was they started generating their own questions about the process. And they could choose when they were in that discussion forum, whether they wanted to answer some of those questions, and they did. That was exciting to see them move from the comments, which they were very interested in talking about, but also then moving on to the actual process and how what they learned through that process and how they were going to use it next.
So let's think about some important components that we talked about evaluate. So in our previous phase, it was important for them to provide feedback to each other. But what good is feedback if you don't have the opportunity to process it? So in this evaluate phase, as Patty already mentioned, they went around and they were able to look for a clear purpose at the feedback that was given. We framed it by coming up with some criteria. They helped us. Again, co-creation is important. They decided to look at feedback that they felt confirmed their thinking, or that they had questions about the feedback or something that intrigued them, and that drove their conversation. And again, what was also critical was having a discussion protocol, very clear structures that students could use in order to process, reflect upon this information, and really own it when they thought about now seeing themselves through the lens of researchers. Here you can also see where we had a Microsoft form. When we talk about the evaluation process, just as we push our students to reflect on feedback and to use that feedback to expand and to go back and to revise, the same is true for us as educators. So we gave our students the opportunity to evaluate the process. This is for us to then go back to think, how do we want to enhance what we're offering our students? Are there any areas that we can tweak? because evaluation is not just for our students, but we want their feedback so we can make sure that we are challenging them as readers, writers, and thinkers in authentic ways that allow them to use their voice and give them choice. So how will you allow students to evaluate their thinking on the process that they went through in order to grow their understanding and depth of knowledge on a topic? That metacognition, thinking about what they explore, making sure it's structured, very clear expectations, and then allowing the students to use their voice to help you evaluate the quality of the lesson design. So here we bring it together, and we're sharing for you some of the resources that we are sharing for you as you think about how you can then develop your own process. So we have our formative assessments that we use within each phase, because it's important, not just the conferencing and the feedback, but you want a visible evidence of how your students are processing through each phase so you can adjust your teaching moves and they can adjust their thinking moves as needed. And these will be available for you.
And finally, here's our standards alignment. We've listed each of the phases and linked up to the learning targets and the SOL strands, but you'll also notice that the ASL strand is there as well. That would be the American Association of School Librarians. I highly encourage you, if you're thinking about doing a unit like this, you are going to build a learning team. And again, it can be your content teachers, it can be your reading specialists, but think about pulling in your librarian and show her what was done with this, or show him what was done with this unit, because your librarian is an information specialist and she's a collaborator and a teacher. And I know whoever your librarian is, they will be ecstatic to be involved in this creation of this unit.
So now we're going to ask you to take out the sheet of paper from the beginning when you wrote down 2 to 3 words that came to mind when you think of students being assigned research, and reflect on this journey that we went through. And we talk about guided inquiry, stimulating curiosity, building strategically students' background knowledge, showing them how to be critical readers and analyzers of information by using the CRAP test and lateral reading, showing them how to be good questioners, understanding the difference between open questions and closed questions, leveraging open questions to guide their reading and thinking about texts, processing what they have thought about, assimilating that new knowledge in a project proposal that will guide their plan for where they're going, and coming up with a multimodal presentation to share their information where they get feedback, not just from the teacher, but from their peers. And then have the opportunity to have student-led discussion woven into each phase so they're sharing ideas and building from each other. So with this in mind, what are the 2 to 3 words that come to mind when you now think of students being assigned research? Here are some of our resources. And we thank you for your time and hope that you will use guided inquiry to elevate your students' voice and give them choice and position them as researchers and critical thinkers who are prepared to take on the world.